Okay, so we're back to talk about chapter 6, which is form. It is an organizing structure in music. There's lots of different types of forms. We're going to focus on Unit 1 and what you see over here on the left-hand side, which is strophic, through composed, binary, ternary, and the idea of a theme. Form is that larger organizing structure it's generally a larger piece of music, although it can refer to a song also. Strophic and through composed form are really both song forms because they refer not only to music but also text. So strophic would be basically what you hear on the radio today, a verse and refrain, where we have repeated music for each stanza of text. So you might have, a verse, and then we get to a refrain, and then another verse and a refrain. And so you keep hearing the same repeated music even though the words might change. With through composed, there's little repeated section, and we'll have different music for each grouping of text. Okay, we'll be talking more about that as we talk about songs as we go through our historical timeline. Binary form and ternary form. Binary is a 2-part, ternary is a 3-part, and I'm going to show you how that works here in just a moment. And then we have the idea of theme. A theme is a large melodic idea. It is a melody, but it's usually a melody that recurs throughout a group or either a movement or a larger group of several movements. That can be broken into small parts, it can be whole, it can be in different keys, it can be used in a lot of different ways, but a lot of times there's something in that theme that is a general melodic idea that recurs. So a theme is just basically a larger melodic idea that you see repeated throughout a larger piece of music. And again, we will be talking a lot more about this as we actually listen to music throughout the semester. When we go over here and we look at binary form and ternary form, again, it's a 2-part versus a 3-part form. Here's our 2-part form. This is Greensleeves again. We have A, B, B, which basically is a statement A and a statement B. We have A. Very similar. Music is identical until we actually get to the cadence here at the end. B, again, music is very similar until we get to the end. So this is part A and this is part B. With ternary, we generally have only an A and a B. So we have 2 different groupings of music, but the A comes back as a repetition. So we have an A section, completely different music in the B section, and then we return back to that original A section. So it's a 3-part form, which actually just has 2 different groupings of music. Now, when we move on to chapter 7, we're going to be talking about tempo and dynamics. These are 2 of my favorite components of music because this is what really allows the performer to have his or her own expression in music. Tempo is the rate of speed or the pace of music. It could go extremely slow, it could be a funeral dirge, or it could be smoking fast. It really depends on what the composer wanted or how the performer feels that the piece of music should be played. Dynamics describes our volume, and of course it can be very soft or it can go all the way to thunderously loud, again depending on what the composer or the performer would like to do to indicate expression. These terminologies are generally in Italian because it was really the Italian monks that formulated or kind of allowed music its final draft, so to speak. And we'll learn about this more when we go through the historical timeline. But the Italians are really ones that kind of set up music to be what it is today. Those Italian monks that worked in the churches for so many hundreds of years. So most of our terminology until we get to the 20th century is actually in Italian. I'm going to show you a piece of music so that you understand a little bit more about it. So here we can go the tempo markings from very slow. Grave is considered to be the slowest of the slow, and presto is so fast you can't even see somebody's fingers move, it seems like. So we run the gamut here. If we get slower to faster with these tempo markings. And then we have modifiers, molto, meaning very much. So there's a lot of different modifiers that we can put in there so that the performer understands more of what the composer actually wants. Don't spend a whole lot of time with these markings, just know the basics of them. Here's our dynamics. The is also a modifier, so piano means soft, pianissimo means very soft, and that's PP, pianissimo, P being piano. Mezzo, medium, medium piano, medium loud, loud, and super loud. So again, we have these modifiers that will allow us to decrease or increase our volume depending on what the composer needs. So to show you how tempo and dynamics work together, this is a piece of music. It's a piano piece. It's a sonata by a guy named Joseph Haydn, who we're going to study in the classical period. He lived a little bit before Beethoven. And we see here that the beginning of a piece of music is always the information center. I've got a whole lot going on here that tells me everything I need to know to play this piece of music. I've got my clefs, which tells me right hand and left hand, high notes and low notes. The C actually is my meter. C means common time, or that I'm going to count to 4, which is the most common. And then here I have my dynamic marking. I'm going to start out piano, so I'm going to play this softly. And then this gives me my tempo marking, allegro con brio, which really means fast with a lot of motion, with a lot of energy. So gusto, in other words, go for it. So this tells me at the beginning of this piece of music really everything I know to be successful. And we can see that dynamics change. We have piano, piano, suddenly loud, SF means sforzando, or suddenly loud. Back to piano. Oh, and here's a fortissimo in there too. So there's a lot of different tempo markings and dynamic markings that these composers like to use so that you can kind of get inside their head and see what exactly it is that they want you to do as a performer, even, 230 years later, we still know how to play the music. So that's what's kind of nice about it, is that it really, once we have this terminology here, we can use it for forever, and we will always have a general guideline as to how Joseph Haydn wanted us to play this piece of music. Okay, Chapter 8, Music and Words. We're going to be talking about a lot of the terminology in this particular chapter, so pay careful attention to a few things. First of all, secular and sacred, we'll be addressing these in Unit 2 when we get to the early music of the church. Secular means not religious, and sacred means religious. Vernacular, also an important term. That means whatever language the people are speaking. For us, it would be English. Whatever country you live in, whatever language that you speak on a regular basis is considered to be the vernacular. Okay, so Western sacred music is always in Latin, but the secular music might be in another keys, or in another language, whatever that country happens to be speaking. Now, this over here is also very important. We have our 3 text settings, and this is in your book on page 34. I'm going to get over here to this slide. This is pretty important. So we have 3 text setting styles. This is also going to be important when we get to Unit 2. We have syllabic, which is 1 note per syllable. Pneumatic, which is several notes per syllable. We can see here under the word rain, we have several notes here before we move on to the next syllable. And then melismatic, which is many, many notes. I mean, look at this. There's a whole bunch of notes that's on the syllable of Joyce. Okay, so these 3 text settings are going to be really important. I'm going to share one quick example with you for the melismatic text setting, and this is actually that Handel's Messiah. We're going to see that rejoice section where she's taking that Joyce syllable and has all of these notes associated with one syllable, so you can actually hear what that sounds like being performed. So let's take a quick listen here.
Rejoice, rejoice, rejoice greatly. Rejoice, O daughter of Zion.
Now listen here.
O daughter of Zion, rejoice, rejoice,
Okay, so that was highly melismatic. We had a whole lot of notes on one syllable. So that's, when we talk about melismatic text setting, that's exactly a great example of that, where we have many, many notes just on one syllable that she's singing there. It's pretty impressive. So I wanted to share that with you, but know all three terms: syllabic, pneumatic, and melismatic text setting. Okay, chapter 9, really what I want you to remember is that there are vocal ranges here. The four main groups being soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. In between soprano and alto, we have mezzo-soprano, which is a medium soprano, not too high, not too low. Baritone is in between tenor and bass. But most of the time when we are looking at choral music, we see SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So that's the most important thing for you to take from this particular chapter. I'm not going to talk about a whole lot more from anything in this chapter, so don't spend too much more time on this. Just be aware of those vocal ranges. Now we get to our four groups of traditional instruments, and this is what makes me super excited. I happen to be a French horn player by trade, so I really like talking about these groups of instruments that pretty much fit into the orchestra. Not all of them, but most of them do. And our four groups are going to be your string, woodwind, brass, and percussion. There's our string instruments. That was a violin. Here's our cello, harp also, double bass. And of course we have some rock music outside of what would be a part of the normal orchestra. This happens to be a bass guitar. Here we have our woodwinds, flute, oboe, bassoon, and clarinet. These are all reeded instruments except for the flute, which plays in the head joint of the instrument. There we go, James Galway, probably the most famous flutist that ever has lived in the 20th century. Saxophone. Then we get to my favorite grouping. This is the brass instruments. Here we have trumpet, my instrument, the horn, trombone, and tuba. Percussion is generally struck instruments. And yeah, this gal is pretty interesting. She is deaf, but she's able to hear the vibrations of the struck instrument, so that's pretty cool. And then we have the keyboard instruments: piano, organ, and harpsichord would be the main ones there. And there's Lang Lang playing the piano, and most of us are familiar with that. Okay, performing groups. We'll start out with chorus. This is chapter 11. Chorus is generally larger than a choir, but they're both vocal groups. SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And this next term is very important, a cappella, meaning without accompaniment. We're going to be talking about a cappella a lot, especially in early music. So you really want to make sure that you have this term and your knowledge base. You can pull it up anytime because we're going to be talking about this a lot. Chamber ensembles are smaller groups you might play in your living room, so to speak, but in the chamber, small group within a castle, within a palace, something like that back in the day. But these are just smaller groups: quartets, quintets, duos, trios. So smaller groups of instrumentation there. This is on page 48 in your text, and this gives you your standard chamber ensemble. So take a look at that and you'll have an idea of these groupings that you would find in the classical literature. Orchestra, my favorite thing to play in. It does vary in size. Today's orchestra can be as large as 120 people, but when the orchestra first started, it was really about 25 people. So here is our distribution, and you can find this on page 49. Take a look at that. And then finally, I wanted to show you, this is actually what it would look like if you were going to visit an orchestra. You would see this would be the layout for that. So take a look at that, and you can read in your text a little bit more about jazz, rock bands, some of the smaller wind ensembles and that kind of thing. I'm not going to spend any more time on it here. Finally, chapter 12 talks about style, and what I really want you to know from this chapter is this wonderful chart that's on page 57, and it shows us basically where we're going this semester. We're going to start out at 400 AD and learn about all the musical styles and how it progressed all the way to the year 2000 and beyond. So this is basically our entire class in a nutshell, so be familiar with what that chart means, and good luck in Unit 1.